yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are still in the morning. I'm grateful to be here and grateful for this invitation. And I just must say, this is the first time I've ever presented at the U of M since I've graduated, when I finished in 2007 for my graduate school program. I have to just give the foundational information that you'll need to know, which is part of what will guide my conversation today. Um, my heart is in Minnesota. I spent 17 years there, from my young adult years to mid whatever years. And It was some of the best time of my life. Just some of my best friends are there. And I'm a Southerner by birth. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida. And what I'll say is, when I moved from Florida to Minnesota, people thought we were crazy, going from the heat to the bitter cold, but it worked out for us really well. Um, and in those years, I think I've kind of learned to intertwine my Southern values with Midwestern values, which is kind of what makes up who I am today. My connection to the University of Minnesota is a long one, and it's where I found what I feel like my calling is in life, and is a career in restorative justice. And it's not a career, but it's a practice, it's a way of being. And I'm so proud of my Minnesota roots in this field. So I just want to start by talking about my roots. So this is me, I think, late 60s. I think I was 2 or 3 years old, and I'm standing in my grandmother's front yard. And this picture is one of my favorite pictures of me as a child. Um, as I mentioned, just being Southern, there were certain ways that I was raised to be, and they very much feed into this journey that I've been on, which you're going to hear about the latest iterations of that. I was raised by a teacher, um, that third grade teacher that you loved, that you knew would go to the nth degree for you. That was my mother, Dorothy Adams. And my father, Ernest Adams, was the city of Tallahassee's first African American firefighter. He retired as a deputy chief for the city of Tallahassee Fire Department in the late 90s. And I recently lost him, and the city just paid amazing homage to him in this time, recognizing what he had endured in those years to do what he had to do to keep his position, but mostly to be a trailblazer. Both of my parents were that. And coming out of I'm a civil rights baby, and so all that was poured into me was kind of what I was carrying with me when I came to Minnesota in the late 80s. And so in that time and pursuing my career and figuring out what I would do with myself, as I started to learn about restorative justice, that first classroom experience in 1993, I was 8 months pregnant with my oldest child. And that was the first time I heard those two words, restorative and justice, put together. And two words that I would never think would be put together, um, by Dr. Mark Umbright. And over time, um, Dr. Umbright took me under his wing and mentored me into the field. I will forever be grateful to him for that. And my life has forever changed because of my connection with him and the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking in the School of Social Work at the U of M. And I made the most amazing connections over time in my time as a student at the U of M, and then after working for the center as a trainer and uh, associate of the center doing various projects. It has been a joy. I say all of this to say that the marriage of all of what I had connected to the civil rights movement, connected to my time as someone who, as a person of color, as a Black woman from the South, from the deep South, trying to fit in Minnesota. And at the time when I moved to the Twin Cities, I think Minneapolis had a demographic of African American community of 5%. Now, we did not understand where to live when we moved there. So we moved to what looked like Florida to us, the city of Edina. I went days without seeing another person of color, and I couldn't understand it. And of course, over time, learning the city and learning where I wanted to be and who I wanted to be near and what gave me energy, we moved to the city of Minneapolis. I moved on the north side of Minneapolis, contrary to some of the protests of some friends who said I should not live in that area. That is an area where there's a lot of trouble, a lot of activity, crime happens. I will tell you, my experience as a woman of color living on the north side was rich. It was vibrant. I felt safe. I made friends from all walks of life, and I would never change that if I had to go back and do it all over again. And all of this is part of my journey as I started to shape my time as someone learning about restorative justice and major roles of people who are on the north side who were doing restorative justice work at that time. Some of you may know some of those people, some of you in the Twin Cities. One of the people that comes to mind is Alice Lynch. God rest her soul. She passed away a few years ago. But she is one of those people, one of those Northsiders that gave me hope that I could do this, and the ways that she did her work on the North Side, and with communities of color, but also with white folk. When I started to think about what I wanted to do with my education, I had to write a master's thesis. The master's thesis that I chose to write about was involving this knowledge that I had involving the civil rights movement and how I believe that the civil rights movement paved the way for the modern day restorative justice movement. You see, the restorative justice language, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, gives a name to the struggle. It gives a way to repair harm to the things that people have experienced coming out of the civil rights movement and Jim Crow and all the ways that people have been marginalized historically in this country, especially for those who are the descendants of slavery. And so when I started to think about that way that came together for me, we start to live in times where so much has been happening in our community. So much of the ways that we are still living in a lot of what my ancestors have lived in today. And I'll continue talking about that, but I want to pause to talk about what restorative justice is. For those of you who may have some knowledge or may not know at all, I want to share a definition by a colleague and friend, and he is someone who's called the grandfather of restorative justice, Howard Zehr, Dr. Howard Zehr. He says, restorative justice is a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things right as possible. Now, he shares this definition, and this is kind of the definition that many people in the field draw from to talk about what this is from a Western context. Dr. Fania Davis is another person who is a leader in the field and is doing restorative justice work. A large part of it is through her work with youth and the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth organization that she founded. She is now retired as their director, but she is very much at the heart of their work.
Sheryl, I hate to interrupt you. Could you expand your slides so we could see them? They're small right now. In your screen share, if you go to the lower right.
I am.
Let's see if we can switch. Please continue. Just please continue.
And I'm sorry for that. I'm using Google Slides. I had no idea this would be a problem. What I will say about Dr. Fania Davis is that she talks about restorative justice in the way that she says, restorative justice recognizes this, rooted as it is in indigenous principles of healing and reconciliation. It seeks crime as damage, as harm to relationships, and justice therefore must heal that damage and repair that harm. Restorative justice seeks to heal the harm rather than replace it. One of the things that I look at when I have been thinking about how the lenses that we look at a specific discipline, especially for those of us who are people of color, often come through a Eurocentric lens. And what I'm really hoping is that we can transcend beyond what we've been taught in ways that predominantly white communities see things, especially seeing harm as it relates to restorative justice, and look at it from many lenses, and one of which is through the lenses of people of color. One of the things that I am interested in doing is really expanding what restorative justice is beyond the textbook definition, but really to think about it in terms of how it relates to all people. I do want to say that at its core, restorative justice is a concept, an idea that comes from indigenous roots. It comes from the indigenous people of this country and beyond. I have a colleague, Dr. Edward Valandra, who talks very eloquently about the ways that we look at restorative justice, and how America, as we are trying to grapple with how we come together and how we overcome historical harm, one of the first harms is the ways that our country has been divided because of the ways that they have ignored indigenous people. And so until that first harm is dealt with, America will not overcome some of the historical harm. And then obviously the historical harm that it has in overcoming how we overlook slavery, how we don't acknowledge those who have come from slavery and how we reconcile today by acknowledgement and reparations. And so all of that to say that we are in a time where, due to recent events, right now, we're cracked open. And when I say that, I mean, for a long time, I've been having these conversations with white people. And not to say that people haven't been listening, because they have, but I think in larger numbers, we are hearing from and seeing people, and some people are seeing us for the first time. And when I say us, I mean people of color, specifically Black and brown people. And I feel like it's a time when people are saying, I'm listening, I'm tuning in. How can I change these things? And so I want to talk about a publication that recently came out. I wrote a chapter in a book, and I'm just going to hold it up, and I'm hoping this is a full screen for you. It's called Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities. This book is written by practitioners in the field of restorative justice, people of color who have talked about their journeys in the field and how they are grappling with the different walks that they have with relationship to the work. I wrote a chapter called Calling Out Whiteness. And what I mean by that is, when I consider some of the places that I've been, I think about coming to Minnesota after being in a very diverse community, growing up in a diverse community all my life, and coming to places where I'm the only one, often being, whether it be in a classroom or a place of work or in my community, just where I live, and what that has been like for me. And so I'm going to pause for just a second, because I see that there have been folks who've been asking some questions and raising their hands. And I don't know if it's related to slides or if it's related to some of the things that I'm saying. But I just wanted to touch in just a moment and pause for anything that I should be paying attention to at this time.
Yes, Cheryl, thank you. Could you repeat for Jeffrey, who is the name of the person who wrote the first definition of restorative justice you mentioned earlier?
That is Dr. Howard Zehr.
Dr. Howard Zehr, thank you very much.
Zehr. Yes, and he's well known and very, very Googleable. So he is someone who is probably, I would say, along the same lines as Dr. Mark Umbright, who is at the University of Minnesota. These are leaders in the field who have been pioneers. Dr. Fania Davis, all of these people, very easy to find. They have been very outspoken on the topic and have written several books and articles on the topic of restorative justice.
Thank you, Cheryl. And a quick note, you did nothing wrong earlier, everyone. If you want to see the slides bigger or Cheryl's camera bigger, simply just double click on it. That is on our end. I'm sorry to have interrupted you earlier.
No worries.
Carol asks, what does crime as damage mean, please?
Oh, well, I mean, probably, in terms of the way Fania described it, sometimes thinking about crime as something that, and I think in terms of damage, maybe something that cannot be recovered from. Damage meaning, especially if it depends on what type of crime. Sometimes if someone is looking at things, which that could be crime against, in terms of damage that might be done in community. There might be ways to recover from that. And then there may be crime that is done against individuals. And I think crime is viewed as just damage may be something that people don't necessarily see a way through, if that's helpful. And I do want to say that that was Fanya's way of defining, her that was part of her definition of restorative justice, and I really would prefer to lend her to respond to that, but I believe that that might be the direction she was going.
Perfect. Thank you, Cheryl. Not a question, but a comment. Frederica says in the chat box, I'm loving this. You're amazing, Cheryl. Thank you. We agree, Frederica. Moving on. Michael asks, I was wondering what role government employees, and Black Lives Matter are playing in restorative justice or can play moving forward. Thank you, Michael.
Well, Michael, let me keep going, and I hope that I can kind of circle back to that one. But definitely, government, Black Lives Matter, in terms of how what roles people can play. I think a lot of it has to do with some of this direction that I'm going, and then I'm going to circle back around to some of the things that are happening currently.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, Cheryl.
All right, I'm going to continue. So in talking about living in an all-white space, doing my work in an all-white space, being a student in an all-white space, what I've learned and come to realize is that because I lived in this environment for a long time, I didn't attribute a lot of what I was feeling. And even as I was writing this chapter, it occurred to me one day, oh my gosh, what I'm experiencing is a form of trauma. When I'm in an all-white space, and depending on how long I'm in an all-white space, it starts to wear on me. And I'm gonna say it like this. I was having a conversation with someone talking about this presentation, and I realized, if you can recall what it's like to be on a job interview and know that every word that you're saying is being evaluated, every body movement, every way that you are trying to convey your ideas and experiences is being scrutinized. For some people, especially people of color, when you are in an all-white space, it can be like being on a job interview all day. If you are working in an all-white space where you don't get to integrate with people of color, and you're the only one, you're always seen, you're always heard. When you're present, it's noticed. When you're absent, it's noticed. All of that plays into what I consider to be somewhat like a traumatic experience, because you're always on. Does that mean I'm being fake? No, but it does mean that I'm aware. It means that I'm kind of acting in excess in some ways, because I know that I'm the different one. And so with that, that's what, for me, being in all white spaces looks like, feels like, and in some ways, I do not live in a society where I want to stay in this trajectory. That is why I call this chapter Calling Out Whiteness, because I do believe that when I talk about it, I really am saying that, and I'll quote from the book, when I say, over the years, I've become more emboldened to call out whiteness and white privilege in many settings, most especially in the spaces where I am working as a practitioner of restorative justice. By saying that I call out whiteness, I mean that I inform those who are in power or leadership that as a person of color, I recognize that the creation of predominantly white work settings is a form of white supremacy, and I ask them to recognize it as well. And so that to me is what this whole idea of calling out whiteness is. And I have just become less concerned about feeling like I can't do that. I'm going to lose something if I say something about it. What I really want people to understand is when we have situations where they're all white in 2020, there's something egregiously wrong about that. In the United States, one of the things that I've been doing is I've been reading a lot on this topic called the browning of America. There's even some writings on it if you Googled the browning of America. But the idea that we are in the United States, you would think that white is something that is predominant throughout the world based on what you see here. But really, white is a minority in the world. But in the United States, we don't live like that. Experts say that in about 30 years, we will probably be transformed. We will have transformed the ethnicities in the United States to where white will be a minority. So thinking about that, my hope is that folks would keep that in mind as they consider when all white spaces convene, and I don't believe that it's a conspiratorial thing, but I do believe that intentionality can make changes when it comes to what all white spaces look like. One of the things that I ask people to consider in my chapter is asking yourselves, what can you do to transform these spaces? And so I think about this in a way of using restorative justice as a way to dismantle all white spaces. And I think about that in terms of how we want to do it with care. We're not trying to, I don't think, unless I'm not heard, I am hoping that when I am expressing and calling out whiteness, that it's honored in that understanding of others in whatever community I'm in, that they would want to know how to dismantle. And so I'm hoping that people would walk forward as a partner in this. And so I'm going to talk more about that shortly. First, it is about naming the situation. I've often been asked to be a part of a project, be part of an organization, and sometimes I'll evaluate just simply by who's involved, who's part of this effort. And if I see that the majority of the folks there are white people, then my inclination might be to decline. Not always, but in some instances I've chosen to decline. And I'm even fair in my ways of talking about that. I choose my words in ways that I'm inviting people to consider the alternatives. This may be a situation where I might be able to be talked into joining or be partnering or whatever, if I know that the intention of the folks is to transform that space. And maybe I might be inclined to bring partners in that are people of color. But I also encourage those who haven't considered people of color to be a part of that particular effort or community to consider that also. I shouldn't be the only one bringing in people of color. And I think that's another challenge with being in situations where they're all white, is that the people of color are often the ones who it's incumbent upon to make those overtures to bring in other people of color, and not the responsibility of the white folk. I do consider education to be important. And when I say education, it doesn't mean you have to go back to school or take a course. I do believe education and training in various ways, anti-racism training being one of the major ways that we can develop a way of dismantling all white spaces, because we're thinking in ways. As a baseline, I think that we owe it to ourselves, if we haven't taken a training of any kind, an anti-racism training, and let me be clear, it's anti-racism and not diversity training, not a lot of other named things that kind of hint at anti-racism, but really don't go to the heart of it. An anti-racism training is going to teach the folks in the spaces how to look at what white supremacy is. They're going to look at ways to dismantle white supremacy. They're going to name the ways that it exists structurally. Those are important elements of any anti-racism training. And understanding that racism is systemic. It's not just someone saying a name or being ugly to someone else. Although that's not to say that that doesn't exist, but it's to say that it's because systems are set up in a way that privilege white people as superior to people of color, and the ways that over time, historically, that the distance between people of color and whites has continued to grow and grow. So with that, it's incumbent upon all people, I believe, to take anti-racism training. I say that to people of color as well as white people. I do think for white people, I have seen where the people of color lean in and do all the things necessary to gain the knowledge, to understand what this is, and white people opt out. It seems like it's an optional thing for white people, but the reality is it's important for everyone. And it's a baseline. Anti-racism training is not the cure, it is just the start. So assembly and participation of diverse groups of people. So thinking about what that looks like. One of the things that I really encourage people to do is think about the projects that you have when you are starting a project. There's a natural inclination to pick the people you enjoy working with. There's nothing wrong with that. We all do that. But I believe thinking in ways that are anti-racist, we're going to look at how can we be as inclusive as possible in bringing together people who look through all different types of lenses in order to make a project or an effort great. And if we're not doing that and we're just defaulting to the people that make us happy, a lot of times, especially for white people, that can be a situation that produces an all-white group. And then the rub is that there's someone who may say, oh my goodness, we overlooked and we forgot we need to make this diverse. So when do I get a call? When all the decisions have been made and it's all ready to be tied up except that last little bow hasn't been put on. And then they want me for window dressing. I call that the sprinkle effect. We all like donuts, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm a Krispy Kreme fanatic. I think Krispy Kreme died in Minnesota, and I was really sad about that. But anyway, we all love a good donut with sprinkles on it. And that's what happens in some of these communities where they sprinkle a little diversity to show, hey, we're diverse. Now, some of the sprinkles is one sprinkle, which is really sad, but it's the idea that that is not inclusive. The sprinkle effect is not inclusive. The sprinkle effect should not exist because it's still playing into the white ways that things are done. If we're really considering how we build a project, we're going to include those people from the ground up. Their voices matter and count at the beginning, at the inception of a project. It's going to require commitment to process. I do think that when we talk about how we do these things, I do believe that process, a restorative one, in my opinion, is important. I don't know what people know about restorative processes, and I don't have a lot of time to share, but I do wonder for many of you if you've ever participated in a talking circle. And when I say circle, I mean it physically, people sitting in a circle, people using a talking piece as the way to guide the conversation. So whoever has the talking piece has the floor. And so when we don't have the talking piece, we are not speaking, we are listening, and we're listening very intently. Being fully present is important in the circle process. One of my teachers expressed it like this. He said, you listen with generosity, meaning you give your best ear. You are fully present to hearing what someone has to say. And then you're generous in what you share, not by using many words, but by using your very best words and speaking with intentionality. The last thing that I would say about dismantling all white spaces is partnering with accomplices. I know that we talk a lot in anti-racism work about having allies. I'm not against allies, but I want to get people to think up the next level. An ally is someone, in my opinion, does great at understanding and partnering with people of color and hearing their experiences and expressing empathy. But I believe an accomplice is someone who is lockstep. I go where you go. I'm willing to take a hit if you have to take one. And I'm willing to go to jail if you have to go to jail. And that's how it was in the civil rights movement. When people had accomplices, and they don't talk about them very often, but when it happens, it means that maybe that white person might lose their lives. Like, for instance, Viola Gregg Liuzio, a white civil rights activist and mother of 5, traveled to Alabama in March 1965 to help the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Dr. Martin Luther King with its efforts to register African American voters in Selma. Not long after her arrival, Liuzzo was murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan while driving a Black man, Leroy Moton, from Montgomery to Selma. Moton survived the attack by feigning to be dead, Luzo was the only known white woman killed during the civil rights movement. And I'm not suggesting that what you will do in terms of being an accomplice will get you killed, but I am suggesting that for many white people, when things get tough for our friends of color, if your intention is to help, then you must lean in. You must be willing to risk discomfort. And unfortunately, that is where a lot of white people have failed communities of color and people of color as individuals, by checking out, by saying this is hard, by backing out of projects because things don't look the way that it should look from a Eurocentric perspective, by saying no when if a yes could be the survival of someone's business. By saying yes, it could mean that maybe I take a hit, but I can afford it. But this other person, it's about their survival. So in that way, there's a desire to be in community, close community with those who are people of color, knowing that being white has its own privilege, and sometimes it requires that connection to raise up people of color. One of the things that has been bittersweet of late is the passing of Representative John Lewis. My heart is full when I think about his work, his commitment. I lament because I never got the opportunity to meet him, but I did live in the state of Georgia for years, and I just took for granted the opportunities that I had to go to his office or talk to him in community because he was there. And for many people that met him or got maybe even knew him, if someone's on this call that knew him, I know that he would have talked to me. I know that he was that kind of person that would have engaged. He talks so much about this idea of good trouble. And he says, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I think about that in these times, and I'm going to say that when I heard about what happened to George Floyd, something broke in me. Here is a person who lived in a place that is nothing but joy in my heart. When I hear Minneapolis, I think of so many happy times. And when I saw what I saw, I thought, no way. First, I saw a clip of the incident. And then it was revealed that someone had videoed the whole thing, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I made myself watch it in full. And I looked at that video for reasons that I felt like it was my duty, and not because I want to play into the sensational parts of this, but because I thought about Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, who was murdered brutally in 1955 in Mississippi, young man. And when his mother in Chicago, got his body, and she told the funeral, the people who funeralized him, to leave the casket open because I want the world to see what they did to my baby. And in the same way, I watched. I watched until I knew that this man had no breath left in his body. I watched him fight, and it was horrible. And when all of these officers picked up his body and dumped it on the gurney like a piece of trash, it just made me so broken. And then I'm not saying that I saw this in everyone's faces, but that officer who stood on his neck, he got up, he stood up, and it looked like it was another day at the office, ready to move on to the next thing. And for me, it was just it helped me to understand that if I ever had a doubt that white supremacy isn't a thing, this was the moment that I knew for sure that this is real, that there are people who walk this earth, white people who walk this earth, who do not value Black lives, who do not believe that a Black life is worth saving, that do not believe that a Black life is equal to theirs. So when I hear people talk about Black Lives Matter, and they have this way of saying, well, all lives matter, or why do you have to say that? I don't have a choice but to say that, because for me, I want to feel like you see me. This chocolate brown skin, when I'm in an all white space, it is seen. There is no way you can look through me. I am not translucent, but I have been treated as if I'm invisible at times, which is so crazy because I am nothing. If I am nothing, the melanin in my skin suggests that I am visible. If I don't say a word in a room of all white people, I am visible. And so I matter, I count. I am a human being equal to any person in the room. And so the fact that we are still in times where that is an issue when we say Black Lives Matter, until all the white people in my sphere say that is true, I will continue to call out whiteness. I will continue to talk about the ways that we dismantle it. I will continue to be unapologetically vocal about these things. I do believe that ultimately it is up to you. It is up to everyone to think about what work they must do in order to make changes, to consider how to be anti-racist. There is no one way to be anti-racist. I have a professor friend who said that, and I thought that was so profound. I wish I could give you an equation and it was that easy for some of you. Some of you feel like you need that. I say the fact that you have to struggle to figure it out, and it means different things for different people, I think that is important. That is important work, and it is the most important self-work that you will ever do, to figure out how to get along with your neighbor, especially if your neighbor looks very different from you. And so when you look at that and you decide, I'm willing to do the work, it's not just, as my friend and I joked the other day about, you can't watch the movie The Help and come back and say, what can I do? You're gonna have to do the work. The work means You're going to have to ask some uncomfortable questions of people you're in relationship with, not the people you don't know. And you're going to have to be careful to not wear out the one Black friend or the few Black friends or the few people of color that you have in your life. Part of it is making new relationships and forging ahead to develop a great understanding, mutually respective relationship with more people of color. At the end of the day, we are at a time, as I said earlier, that we are cracked open, that people are listening and checking in ways that they never have. And I'm excited about these times. I'm certainly not excited about the fact that it's all happening within the time of a pandemic, but so be it. I believe that in this moment, we will be more than remiss if we don't take advantage of opportunities to connect and to grow. I think the fact that you're in this time, and even as we are socially distanced and sheltering in, there are ways to be connected to people and people you have never been connected to before. And I challenge you to make new friends with intention and a desire to reconnect with self in ways, and ask those questions of yourself about how you want to be and how you want to make changes internally that would impact the ways that we help each other in this world. Because most people who are connected to this probably do work in community where you are helping other people, you are serving other people, you're giving services to other people. And so if it's not through these lenses that you are looking at, then I just challenge you to make those changes, to think differently. I'm going to stop here. I know I'm about at the hour mark, and I know that there are people who've been asking questions, and I can quickly shift into that. But I am grateful for this opportunity. I didn't share nearly as much as what I wanted to share, but I hope it will inspire you all to read and to research. Please feel free to be in contact with me. I thank you so much for this time that we can be together.
And thank you, Sheryl. I think I speak for everyone when I say you are a powerful speaker and a powerful person, and thank you for sharing. Did you want to share your video clip right now, or should we wait for
Yes,
that and go into some questions?
I do want to share that. And
Okay.
let's go ahead and share that, and it will kind of share my sentiment, and I'll say a few things after that.
Sure. Could I ask you to stop your screen share, please?
Yep.
Thank you. One moment, everyone. I get a chance to do what I asked of everyone else.
I'm a young Black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but I look around and I see what's being done to my kind. Every day I'm being haunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
I just wanted to play the beginning of that video because I could listen to that that's the way that that young man is expressing himself in his Blackness, an expression of wanting to live. I think this young man could have sung that song 50 years ago. He could have sung that song 150 years ago. I think the challenge is that we are still singing that song today. And I just ask that we think beyond, I just want to live. And it's sad, it's scary, it's ironic, but I think that is where we are as a country, that we have to value the lives of all people to the extent that it is not an impassioned plea, but it is an acceptance that we all deserve to prosper. We all deserve rich lives, and in the ways of being able to thrive in this country. So in that, I wanted to leave you with that expression, and thank you again.
Thank you, Sheryl. That was so powerful, so powerful. Are you ready for some questions?
I am.
So many, and I want to make the best use of your time for our
Sure.
guest today. Carol asks, is racism a psychological disorder, and is there any research aimed at determining whether it is or not? Finally, if it is, what is the treatment protocol, and does it require national leadership and legal remedies, such as amendments to the Constitution?
Wow. And I am not a therapist. I think of racism as something that should be treated, in the sense that I believe that it is something that can be overcome with things in terms of education. I do believe in terms of disorder, I don't know that, I don't know if I would necessarily say that. But I'm not coming from the angle of psychology, and I don't have a background in psychology, so I don't want to comment and go down a road that I wouldn't have enough knowledge about. But I do believe that there are ways to help overcome racism, and it is through a person acknowledging first that they are racist. And I think that for some white people, because they name, I'm not racist, I don't have a racist bone in my body, those kind of statements, I think that prohibits them from educating themselves further. And I think that is part of the challenge, is the acknowledgement first. It's no different than anything else that we would say about ourselves if there's something wrong, is we have to acknowledge that something is wrong first before it can be treated. So I'm going to stop there about my ways of thinking about this. And yes, I think that there should be resources, but I don't know if I have a fully baked idea about that at this point.
Thank you, Sheryl. Thank you for your question, Carol. There's a few statements that came in, Sheryl, that I think are important to point out. Alicia, Natasha, Telesia all mentioned, I identify with the analogy, the all-day job interview. It's exhausting. There is a constant code switching. Thank you, Sheryl. It is exhausting all day, every day. Yes, thank you all for sharing. Sheryl, would you like to comment on that?
Just that I know that it's true. I'll share a little story. I told you about my father at the beginning of this. Imagine, my father was approached by someone who saw him as someone that he could use to consider how he would integrate the fire department in Tallahassee. He was like Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson had to do all kinds of prep before he could actually be on a team and play the first game. And it took a lot of time. The first meeting that my father had with this man was just kind of, what do you think? Could you do this? And he kept asking my father to come back appointment after appointment. He met with this man for a whole year. He didn't get paid during that year. He was doing other things with his life. And I'm sure he started to believe that this wasn't going to happen. And finally, he got the job. So I think about that when I think about the all-day interview, and I think about my father and all he had to endure, and then whatever he had to do once he got on the job. He didn't even talk about all those days. But the point being on is a thing. And if you can think about a performance that you've ever given and what it requires, in some ways it resembles that. And like I said, it's not about us being fake, but it is about knowing how we are seen and how we are scrutinized and analyzed, especially when we're in all white spaces.
Thank you, Sheryl. To dovetail with the all white spaces, Daniel asked earlier, do you define all white spaces as all white or as primarily white? Could you
I say primarily white. I think it's hard to say all. When I say all white, it is not meaning I know for sure. I am saying it is predominantly white. Yes. So sorry if that kind of gives this understanding that I know that I know that I know. I don't. But I can say with a lot of certainty that many of these spaces that I've been in have been predominantly white.
Thank you. Thank you. Tammy asks, how can we ask agencies to stop the colonial way of thinking that they're forcing people and children to act and respond in a colonized way instead of being able to express themselves in their own terms?
Okay, well, that's a big question, and that's not a small ask.
Sure.
But I believe that what happens is happening in isolation, and I don't mean it's happening in small ways. I mean the people that it's impacting it's happening in isolation, and I believe that it's important that people tell their stories about being mistreated, about being put in these situations where they're being treated as in ways of being colonized. I think one of the things that I got the opportunity to do last year about this time, I participated in a couple of day-long experience working with people who are trying to transform healthcare. And in that, working with people of color in healthcare, especially building trust, because there's a lot of documented experience as to why people of color do not trust medical professionals due to the fact, especially for Black people, who were experimented on against their wishes. There's a very long history of lack of trust in healthcare. Getting people to tell their stories is kind of a way of remedying that, so that people can see that this is not done in isolation. This is systemic. And the more people tell their stories and the more people speak out, then it can be called out. But I think that is part of the challenge, is if I'm being mistreated and I don't talk about it, and I'm not putting it all on just the people of color, but I think because we know that these problems are systemic, that as white people, as people who are decision makers, the ways that things are done is proactive in asking the right questions and being in community with people and understanding that there are other ways. I think there are other ways to partner in community around concepts and ideas through a certain lens, maybe going to other partners, especially of diverse communities, to have discussions on how to do those processes better, so that the questions can be asked and people's humanity can be recognized in better ways. And I don't have a textbook solution for that, but I do believe that a lot of it is relational work that people aren't willing to always do, but they need to.
Thank you, Cheryl. So true. Sharon asks, wondering if you can share any thoughts on transformative justice versus restorative justice
Oh,
and how these terms are used. I think you see where this is
mm,
going. At times interchangeably, especially in the context of racial injustice uprisings now and the call for abolishing the police and prison systems.
wow. You all are not asking me questions I can answer easily. There are fine lines. I believe that, and I don't want to, I'm not an expert in transformative justice. And so I want to be fair to not, I don't want to say I can tell you that difference in the fine lines. I think in the broader ways, they are more than cousins. They are siblings of one another, because the idea is that you're taking someone's lived experience, especially, and I'll say from a restorative context, that especially in the aftermath of harm, and putting them in through a process. And process might be the delineation between the two is process, as to how we get to the other side of harm, how we get to the other side of a problem or challenge, or ways of building community. So in that way, that might be where the difference exists. And I really don't want to go much further than that. I feel like a lot of the challenge for me today is you're asking me questions that are somewhat out of my depth. And I don't want to give you a wrong answer, because I'm not an expert in another field. But that transformative justice is a whole other field of work that I respect, and I work alongside people who do it. And I just think it's best that those people give those definitions in the best ways, and I don't want to cross that line. But I hope I've given enough of an understanding in the ways that I see it, to be helpful.
That was a nice way to look at it, Cheryl, and you are a true pro. um, so there were several questions came in actually. Eric, Andy, Anonymous. Do you have any specific resources you'd like to share on anti-racism trainings?
Mm,
And to dovetail with that, Millicent added, should white individuals attend anti-racism training to get some grounding in racism and white privilege?
mm. Absolutely. I think as much pre-work that can be done before any type of training, like along the lines where you're going to be integrated with a lot of folk. I think any pre-work that can be done is helpful. Um, and even within the context of training, there are ways that people caucus as white communities and people of color separately, because then people can start to really identify and be comfortable with others who are going through the same challenges due to the ethnicity, the skin that they were born in. And I'm trying to remember what else you asked me. I
If they should attend pre-racism training to get some
Yes.
grounding.
Yes, if there's an opportunity for such a way for them to get some type of do some pre-work or get some pre-training, that would be ideal. It's not always possible just due to resources and what is available in a particular community. And I've seen that done where people have gone to the same training with no major pre-work. But I could see where it would definitely be helpful. Someone asked about different types of, I can't remember, was it different types of?
Yeah, if there were any
Training?
resources you would recommend.
I will say some of the ones that I've attended, and there's probably a myriad of other trainings that I'm not naming. I've had the good fortune of, one, at the University of Minnesota, a lot of my training came out of the work that I did just in taking courses at the U on, you know, a lot of the civil rights movement courses that I took touched on anti-racism work. I also attended trainings in North Carolina um, by the Racial Equity Institute. I also had the good fortune of being in community with and being trained by the Roots of Justice is another uh, uh, restorative, I would say somewhat akin to restorative justice work, anti-racism training um, that I have the, you know, I'm in community with folks there. Um, Another training that I have been curious about, but I haven't taken is through Crossroads. I'll be taking one of their trainings coming up fairly soon. So these are ones I just know about, but there are a lot. I would say when you are consider what community you are doing this with, because language and concepts are everything. And if you're taking this training over here, but the people in your community are doing something else, I really invite you to do it together as a cohort. That is going to probably have the best impact on your community.
Thank you for sharing that, Sheryl. And I know some of you, we've had such a rich and vibrant conversations going on in the chat box the whole time. And so many of you have shared resources and links with each other. Peter, Jillian, my wonderful colleagues at the center, I hope you're out there kind of gathering and aggregating these so I can maybe put something together to send out with Sheryl's slides and everything afterwards. Sheryl, sorry, we'll get right back to it. Do you need a drink or a breath? You have just...
Oh, I got my water.
Okay, I want to be mindful of your comfort too. Tammy says, how do you deal with the exhaustion of explaining an education of white people about systemic racism and the effects on children and families and implicit bias and how damaging their actions are? Thank you, Tammy.
Okay, can somebody ask me like a 6-word question? Okay, let's see. How do I deal with the exhaustion? You know, I didn't talk about this. A lot of it is through the people that I have in community that hold me up. I have I am not a wealthy woman. I tell people this all the time. I'm not a wealthy woman, but one thing I am wealthy in is relationships. I have friends from all walks of life that I am able to unpack a lot of what I'm dealing with. At a moment's notice, I probably have about 10 people I could call when I've experienced something or I'm going through something where it's like heavy because I'm dealing with some type of something that triggers something related to my trauma that I might be experiencing being in an all-white space, or it might be feeling marginalized or feeling less than because I am a person of color, and being made to feel invisible. I've had those conversations. So in some ways, my relational work is what gets me through. And then what was the other part of the question with all the big words? No.
Sure. To follow up, white people are exhausting, we know.
Oh, well.
And the effects on children and families and implicit bias and how damaging their actions are.
I think that what I'm seeing, and I'm guilty of my biases playing into how I speak and how I relate to people. I'm not an expert at that, but I think one of the things that I am doing currently is studying and reading and meditating a lot in the way of mindfulness. I believe that honestly, a lot of the biases that we have, and because we just are flying by the seat of our pants. A lot of the time we're probably more stressed out than our ancestors, because the world is on some levels busier, and we're made to be busier with our cell phones and with media and with work and all the things coming at us, that we often do things unchecked because we're not mindful, we're not intentional. Out in the same ways that I talked about circle process, if I could practice that in my daily interactions with people, I'd be a better person. The reality is the pressures of life get to you, the connections that people make that trigger things make it difficult. And so it is, I think the practice of being mindful is important in this day and age.
Thank you, Cheryl. Very true. Very true. Here's a shorter question. Dana asks, can you please share your definition of reparations, which means different things to different people? Shorter, not simpler necessarily.
I do, I do believe, I believe that reparations are important in acknowledging, and I'll say reparations in terms of what it means to people who are descendants of slaves in the United States. Throughout time since emancipation in 1865, for some it was later than that, you know, about Juneteenth. If you didn't know about Juneteenth up until this year, you did learn this year, because there was enough out there that everybody should know about Juneteenth, that everybody didn't get emancipated at the same time. But the point being, throughout that time, there's been so much compromise to what descendants of slaves should have received, that now it's like, not only did we not receive it, but then you want us to be less than in the community regardless. And so my feelings about that is, because of the ways that we are so far, the disparity between a Black family and a white family who might be doing the exact same things, working the same jobs, similar education, all of that is so major due to the systems that each of these families may have encountered, for better or for worse. That totally applies to why reparations are important. The city of Asheville, I regret that I no longer live in North Carolina, because I might have started making my way to Asheville, but they have started to recognize what it means to give advantages to people of color in ways of business opportunities, in ways of just how one can do something in community as a person of color and be recognized and seen and used in positive ways to their advancement, to the advancement of people of color. I think that's important. I don't know what that looks like in terms of a monetary amount. I do think education is a great way to give reparations. I've always felt like if you knew what people do to go into debt to go to school, especially for people of color, and how I'm not privileged to have someone to pay for my education in the ways of an inheritance, or to attend a school where because I am the descendant of so and so and so and so, I'm entitled to a certain funding source. And so as a result, a lot of people of color have student loan debt. I mean, those are ways that reparations would be very helpful for people of color, because you're starting a work in the workforce, and especially people who do human services type work. We're not getting paid six figures from the get-go. And so therefore, to try to pay off a student loan in the amount of $100,000 or more, will take us ages to pay off because we're not making the kind of money to pay that debt down. And so, in my opinion, those are wonderful ways for descendants of slaves to receive what I would consider to be reparations. And so that, in my mind, those are the things that come to my head. I'm just speaking as me. I'm not representing a group when I say this. It's just things I've often pondered.
Thank you for sharing, Cheryl. We're all here to hear your thoughts. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Kate asks, what do you think it would take for this country to engage in a process of truth and reconciliation? And do you think we'll be able to get to that point? Thank you, Kate.
That is one of the areas that I didn't share about that I wished I had earlier. But truth and reconciliation process is one of the ways that restorative justice lives, and one of the most popular processes that people do know about is the process that occurred in South Africa. But in the United States, there are ways that truth and reconciliation processes have occurred in smaller ways. North Carolina being one of them, there was a truth and reconciliation process there. I did take some time to study out some of these processes, but it really is collectively connecting with what the harm has been. Of course, I know that the state of Mississippi is looking at processes as well, especially when it comes to historic harm. There are ways that we as a nation need to own that. We need to own the historic harm that has taken place against Native Americans. We need to own the ways that we should hear the stories of people who have encountered this. The frightening thing to me is that we talk about making meaning of how, for instance, the Equal Justice Initiative lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, has gained a lot of notoriety. And one of the things that when I visited, it was such a powerful experience. And when I tell you that, you can go for any county in the United States and see where the lynchings were documented. Okay, those were the ones that were documented. There are countless other people who have been lynched in this country that have never been acknowledged. It's never been documented. So we have to know that the number of the documented ones is a fraction of the whole. So knowing that and collectively hearing these stories, and for some of these people, the people there are some people living today who have lynched individuals and have walked free, and there's not been any calls for justice. And some people in these communities know who the people are, and it's either fear or it's whatever is driving it. People know, and they haven't been speaking out. I had a time when I worked briefly for an organization that does work in this area called Southern Truth and Reconciliation, where they network and they work with folks who are doing their own processes around lynching, to help people to collectively not just know about them, but to call people to justice. I believe that that's important in the ways that we think about what a truth process is. And truth meaning we have to define what truth means. Truth isn't just hearing someone's story, but it is acknowledging and affirming it as true for the people who are receiving it. And that's mainly white people. So that's a big part of it, is owning truth and acknowledging truth and acting on it if it is true that something, an atrocity occurred and there was no justice. Then it's incumbent upon the people in those communities who are in power to pursue truth and justice.
Thank you, Sheryl. We have time here for about one more question. We have just about 1 or 2 minutes. And Jillian asks, what can you say about your restorative justice work now and where you envision it going? Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you, Jillian. My restorative justice work now, I am in Kansas, as I mentioned, or it was mentioned in my bio. I am at the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Bethel College. I have the great fortune of being able to do a lot of different things related to my restorative justice work in my daily job. One of the biggest things that we do at KIPCOR is we train educators in restorative practices throughout the state. KIPCOR is we have the distinction of having trained over 1,000 teachers in the state of Kansas for the past decade. And we continue to do more. We're really approaching this in a way of training whole schools, whole districts in restorative practices, getting away from training just one teacher here and there and hoping to spread the movement. But the real movement will take place when a full district says we want to become restorative, and we're training in larger numbers. And that is happening, and I'm excited. There's one particular district in Lawrence, Kansas that is really moving toward that as a whole. Otherwise, I continue to write, as I mentioned, about colorizing restorative justice, the book. There's a lot of projects that are coming out of that are going to be rich and wonderful. And there's so many wonderful people that I get to be in community with around this publication. I'm excited about that. I also am the president of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. We're doing a lot of great work. Currently, as we're not able to be in community with one another due to sheltering in, due to COVID, we have been doing online virtual circles on various topics, but mainly around some of the things that I've discussed about the murder of George Floyd, just giving people a way to process all that they've been dealing with around that in virtual circles. And then beyond that, we've been able to do a lot of work toward what we typically do as a biannual conference. Our next conference will be in 2022 in Chicago. It's the largest convening in the United States of restorative justice professionals. And so, stay tuned to what we will offer in 2022 in Chicago. So those are a few of the things that I'm doing currently. And I'm just excited to be able to have opportunities like this to talk about the work, to talk about what this is and ways that we can transform our communities.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. Thank you for the great work you've been doing, are doing, will continue to do. I know we're all excited about it as well. And I know there's been a big clamoring to have you back, so we're going to have to make a space for you, and we are more than happy to do that. That is our time today, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Practice Transformation, thank you all so much for joining us today and for each part of this amazing series with Christina Combs, Dr. Jessica Gorneau last week, and a extra special thanks to Sheryl Wilson for sharing your time, talents, your heart, your experience with us. This is something we won't soon forget. So thank you, Sheryl.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm grateful to have been here.